Leningrad, November 30th, 1939. The air in the Kremlin room is heavy, thick with the smell of tobacco and absolute power. Marshal Clement Voroshilov, with the confidence of a man who has never known defeat, traces a red line on the map with his gloved finger. The line cuts through Finnish territory, ending in Helsinki. From here to the capital, 40 days, he says, and a satisfied smile spreads across his face, the smile of someone signing an easy sentence. Beside him, Joseph Stalin remains silent. He doesn't need words. His granite gaze, cold and impenetrable, has already decided the fate of Finland. To him, the small nation is not an adversary. It is a geographical obstacle, a nuisance to be swept from the map to ensure the security of Leningrad. Arrogance is not just an attitude, it is the official doctrine. The Soviet Union, an industrial and military colossus with 170 million inhabitants, is about to crush a country of 3.5 million farmers and lumberjacks. It is a matter of mathematics, and the numbers are all in favor of the Red Army. In a few hours, mathematics becomes reality. A tide of iron and fire floods the border. 450,000 men, 2,000 tanks, and 1,000 planes advance like a force of nature. The sky over Karelia explodes in flashes of artillery, and the Soviet radio, with its pompous and triumphant voice, announces to the world, "The heroic forces of the Red Army have crossed the border to liberate the Finnish people from the yoke of capitalism. The campaign will be concluded in a matter of days." In the barracks, the generals toast to a victory they have not yet won. The soldiers, boarding trucks and tanks, sing patriotic songs, convinced that they will participate in a military parade, not a war. Finland will fall before Christmas, they say to each other, a certainty repeated like a mantra. But the land they invade does not care about mantras. The forest watches in silence, and the snow begins to fall. Far from the grandeur of the Kremlin, in the small village of Suomussalmi, the 22-year-old Finnish soldier Lauri Väinänen does not hear the radio. He hears the crackle of wood in the fireplace, the dry sound of his own teeth chattering in the intense cold, and the wind howling like a wolf outside. As he meticulously cleans the barrel of his old Mosin Nagant rifle, the smell of gun oil mixes with that of snow and distant smoke. He thinks of his mother, who until last week believed that war was something that happened in the newspapers, not in her backyard. Lauri is not a soldier by ideology. He is a hunter, a son of the forest. He is ready to die for his home, but he does not yet know that he is about to become part of the most improbable and legendary resistance of World War II. The first contact happens at dusk, on a narrow and winding road surrounded by a sea of pines. A noisy and confident Soviet reconnaissance patrol enters a clearing. Suddenly, the world shatters. A single dry shot echoes between the trees, sharp and deadly. An officer falls. Before his men can react, another shot. A second man tumbles into the snow. And then absolute silence. No sound, no movement. Just the wind. When the rear platoon arrives minutes later, they find the bodies of their comrades scattered like broken puppets, the vapor of their last breath frozen in the air. There are no boot prints, no sign of the enemy, just thin and delicate ski tracks cutting through the virgin snow and disappearing into the darkness of the forest. A young officer, trembling more from confusion than from cold, mutters to himself, "Prizreki. Bele Prizreki, ghosts, white ghosts." The nickname is born there, in that blood-stained clearing, whispered by fear and fog, the white ghosts of Finland. At the Soviet headquarters, the initial reports sound absurd, like dark fairy tales. Entire units disappearing without a trace, tanks burned by civilians with bottles, men ambushed by invisible patrols that move without sound. Voroshilov reads the dispatches and laughs, a guttural and scornful laugh. "Superstitions of tired soldiers," he declares. Stalin, upon hearing about the ghosts, allows himself a smile of cruel irony. "Let them learn from the cold," he says. "General Winter has always been our ally." But they have made a fatal miscalculation. General Winter has no homeland, and in this land he fights alongside his sons. The cold does not teach, it kills. The days pass and the arrogance of the command begins to clash with the brutal reality of the Arctic. The temperature plummets to -35, then -40 degrees Celsius. The wind cuts the skin like shards of glass. The Soviet soldiers, marching in their summer uniforms and leather boots that harden like stone, begin to understand. The presumption of a short war meant there was no winter equipment. Tank engines freeze. Cans of food burst in the cold. Desperate men try to warm their hands on tank exhausts and faint, suffocated by the smoke. Nature mocks their preparation. While the Red Army freezes in place, the Finns, dressed in white, glide through the woods in silence. They are winter itself in motion. The metallic sound of shovels trying to break the ground echoes through the forest. It is a futile, desperate sound. Soviet soldiers, with swollen and bluish fingers from gangrene, try to dig trenches in soil that the cold has turned into granite. The shovels break. The fingers lose strength. A young recruit from Omsk, feeling the numbness creep up his legs, stamps his feet against a tree to ward off the sensation. He does not know that in minutes the bones in his frozen fingers will snap like glass. The war they expected to fight was against men. The war they found is against the planet itself. In the command camp, Colonel Ivan Meretskov, a pragmatic and battle-hardened man, stares at a map that no longer makes sense. The roads his divisions were supposed to follow have disappeared under meters of snow. The rivers his tanks were supposed to cross are now ice traps, too thick to break, but too thin to support the weight of steel. Dozens of T-26 tanks, the pride of the armored force, are stuck, immobile, their engines silenced. The lubricating oil has turned into a solid paste, useless grease. A mechanical engineer, pale from cold and fear, tries to explain the situation to Meretskov. "Comrade Colonel, we need low-viscosity oil and antifreeze additives. Our stocks were not adapted for this climate. Our manuals were written for Ukraine, not the polar circle." Meretskov slams the table. "We have 2,000 tanks, not excuses." But the problem is not mechanical, it is conceptual. Soviet military doctrine, deep battle, was designed for vast plains, for rapid movement maneuvers and overwhelming firepower. The Soviet Union planned a war of movement, and Finland handed them a war of immobility. The cold, silent and relentless, is a more efficient weapon than any army. It needs no ammunition. It simply exists. While the Soviet war machine brines and stalls, the Finns move. North of Suomussalmi, a group of skiers glides through the forest. They are white shadows against a white background. No engine noise, no visible tracks, except the whisper of skis on snow. Each man carries a rifle, some grenades, a bottle of gasoline with a cloth wick, Molotov cocktail, ironically named after the Soviet foreign minister, and an obstinate faith in their own land. They watch a kilometers-long Soviet column, a serpent of steel and men, trapped on a narrow road surrounded by dense trees. The Finnish commander, a 40-year-old farmer, whispers to his men, "Wait for the signal. Let them all enter the trap." When the last supply truck rounds the bend, the white hell begins. Two simultaneous explosions, one at the front and one at the rear of the column, block the road. The serpent is decapitated and tailless. The Soviets are trapped in a corridor of death. Then, from the trees, the white ghosts emerge. precise shots eliminate officers and machine gunners. Molotov cocktails fly through the air, turning tanks into crackling torches. The attack lasts less than 10 minutes, and then silence. The Finns disappear back into the forest, leaving behind a cemetery of burning steel. It is the birth of the Motti tactic. Motti is a Finnish word for a bundle of firewood stacked to be sawn. The Finns apply the term to war. They do not face the Red Army head-on. They saw it. They cut the long columns into isolated pockets, the Mottis, and then let them freeze, starve, and despair, eliminating them one by one. This brutally effective strategy is born of necessity, not doctrine. Every Finnish soldier learns to fight independently, to use the terrain as his primary weapon. There are no front lines, no trenches. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. The Soviets, trained to blindly obey orders from miles away, cannot react. Their strength, their numbers, has become their greatest weakness. In the command bunker, Colonel Meretskov receives increasingly surreal reports. A coded message informs, 44th Rifle Division encircled, communication lost. Another, from a terrified scout, says, we found men frozen standing, in firing position. Meretskov rubs his eyes, exhausted. Frozen standing? A younger officer, his face marked by horror, replies with a trembling voice, yes, Comrade Colonel, death froze them before they had time to fall. Meretskov's war, a war of numbers and maps, has turned into a ghost story. Meanwhile, Lauri Väinö and his squad glide in silence. They are hunters, and the Red Army is their clumsy, noisy prey. Lauri sees the glow of Soviet campfires in the distance, beacons of fear in the darkness. He raises his rifle, holds his breath. A shot. A dry, precise, final sound. A Soviet commander, shouting orders, falls silently into the snow. Lauri feels no triumph, just a cold emptiness. He knows that if he misses, if he hesitates, the cold will kill him before the enemy's bullet reaches him. The cruelest irony of the campaign begins to unfold. The Soviets, with all their resources, become the greatest suppliers to the Finnish army. The Finns, with few anti-tank weapons, simply wait for the tanks to stop due to lack of fuel or freezing. Then they loot them. Weapons, ammunition, food, clothing. A Finnish soldier wearing a Soviet coat comments with dark humor, "They brought us more equipment than our factories could produce in a year." The enemy, with its colossal war machine, is inadvertently arming its adversary. That night, Lauri finds a T-26 tank still warm, smoking slightly. Inside, a young Russian soldier, not much older than him, is alive, delirious from fever and wounds. He repeats a single word, like a prayer, "Domoy, domoy." Home, home. Lauri hesitates, rifle in hand. He looks at the young man's face, a boy's face. In a gesture he himself does not understand, he does not shoot. Instead, he pulls the blanket over the boy and with his hands covers the turret hatch with snow so that the cold will lull him to sleep quickly without more pain. In that moment, the war stops being political and becomes terribly human. When the sun rises, the battlefield looks like an alien planet. Frozen tanks like carcasses of prehistoric beasts. Bodies covered in white, transformed into anonymous statues. And above all, the distant sound of a harmonica playing a melancholy melody in a Finnish camp. They do not celebrate, they just survive. February 1940. The Siberian wind sweeping through Karelia no longer blows between trees. It blows between the ruins of Soviet camps, whistling through the skeletons of burned trucks, and howling over snow mounds that are not just snow. In every shard of ice, there seems to be the echo of a name. And there are many names. Names that will never again be heard in Moscow, in Kiev, in Omsk. The Red Army, the world's largest land force, is dissolving in the ice. Entire divisions, like the 44th and 163rd, have ceased to exist. They were not defeated. They were erased. In an office in Leningrad, a pale secretary compiles the casualty lists. The numbers are so absurd, they seem like a typing error. 126,000 dead, 188,000 wounded or mutilated by the cold, 5,000 missing, probably swallowed by the snow forever. And the number grows with every dispatch from the front. He swallows hard, looks at the omnipresent portrait of Stalin on the wall, and whispers to the empty walls, "They said it would be a parade." On the front, the survivors are human shadows, specters with faces burned by the cold, black and cracked, fingers bandaged in dirty rags, hiding the black flesh of necrosis, empty eyes that have seen things the human mind was not made to process. Many no longer speak, sealed in traumatic silence. Others murmur lullabies from their villages, as if trying to cling to a world that no longer exists. Morale, once a wall of ideological fervor, has disintegrated. What was once faith in the state is now just an animal instinct for survival. Men steal frozen bread rations from each other. They sleep on the bodies of their dead comrades, not out of disrespect, but because the corpses provide an extra layer of insulation against the frozen ground. Soldiers beg to be wounded, a bullet in the leg, a shrapnel in the arm, anything to guarantee them a ticket away from the front line, away from this white hell. In his diary, an artillery captain writes, "The dead are everywhere, frozen, motionless, watching us with glass eyes. The war is no longer a war, it has become a museum of our mistakes." While the reality on the battlefield is one of collapse, in Moscow, the propaganda machine works at a frenzied pace. The general's reports are filtered, sanitized, rewritten. Defeat becomes strategic retreat. Massacre becomes slow but steady progress. The Pravda newspaper publishes triumphant headlines. Soviet heroes crush Finnish fascist defenses. But between the lines, and in the overcrowded hospitals of Leningrad, the truth rots. The Soviet Union, a regime built on the premise of the party's absolute truth, now drowns in its own lies. Blindness is not an accident. It is a policy. The system prefers to sacrifice 100,000 men rather than admit a single mistake. It is in this scenario of chaos and denial that a name begins to echo like a terrifying legend among the Soviet troops, a name whispered in fear around campfires. Simo Häyhä. They call him Bielaya Smart, the White Death, a diminutive farmer, just over 1.6 meters tall, who becomes the avenging spirit of the forest. Using a rifle without a telescopic sight, because the lenses froze and the sun's reflection could betray his position, he moves among the trees like a ghost. The Soviets send elite sniper squads to hunt him. None return. They bomb the areas where he is sighted. The next day, the tally of Soviet officers' bodies increases. He becomes the symbol of everything they cannot control. The invisible, silent, and incomprehensibly lethal enemy. But to the Finns, Häyhä represents something deeper, the perfect fusion between man and his environment. He is not driven by hate. He is a hunter. Every shot is an act of calculation, patience, and intuition. When the bullet leaves the barrel of his rifle, it is not a political act. It is geography itself in motion, reaping those who do not belong in that place. The military engineer, Andrei Petrov, is one of the few who understands the scale of the catastrophe. He does not see ghosts, he sees systemic failures. In his underground shelter, he reviews the reports: engine failures, cracks in gun steel, hypothermia mortality rates. He knows what those numbers mean. The problem is not a lack of tanks, it is an excess of ideological blindness. Soviet industry produced 2,000 tanks a month, an engineering marvel. Finland destroyed 100 a week, with gasoline bottles and courage. In an act of desperation or suicidal bravery, Petrov writes a memorandum he knows will never be read by Stalin. Victory is impossible. The doctrine has failed. The technology has failed. The enemy masters the terrain, the climate, logistics, and time. We master only the lie we tell ourselves. He hands the report to a political commissar. A week later, Petrov is called back to Leningrad. On the train taking him away from the front, he watches through the window the columns of smoke rising from the forest. He thinks of everything he has seen. 45-ton tanks turned into ice coffins, men whose boots had to be cut from their frozen feet, absurd orders that sent thousands to their deaths. In his notebook, he jots down a final reflection. Machines can be repaired. Ideas cannot. Upon arriving in Leningrad, he is not received as an engineer, but as a suspect. He is taken to a damp NKVD basement, the secret police. The interrogator, with cold and bored eyes, asks, "Comrade Petrov, do you believe that the glorious Red Army has failed?" Petrov, exhausted by lies, looks at the man and replies with deadly calm, "No, the ideology failed first." 3 days later, Andrei Petrov disappears from official records. The price of truth in the empire of blindness was eternal silence. March 1940. Winter begins to lose its strength. The relentless cold yields, and the thaw begins. It is a soft sound, almost merciful, the drip of water from branches, the crack of ice on rivers. But each drop that falls reveals what the snow tried to hide. The battlefield emerges from its white shroud, and what is seen is a vast cemetery. Bodies, vehicle wreckage, abandoned weapons, torn flags. The land, frozen for months, now exhales the smell of death. The murmur of the thaw seems to carry with it the voices of 300,000 men. In Moscow, even Stalin can no longer ignore the catastrophe. The special operation of 3 weeks drags on for over 100 days of humiliation. Reluctantly, he orders the start of peace negotiations. But even in failure, arrogance demands the appearance of triumph. The Moscow Peace Treaty is signed on March 12, 1940. On paper, it is a Soviet victory. Finland is forced to cede 11% of its territory, including the Karelian Isthmus, the cradle of its national culture, and the country's second-largest city, Viipuri. Over 400,000 civilians, 12% of the Finnish population, are forced to abandon their homes and become refugees in their own country. It is a devastating price, and yet in the streets of Helsinki, the people do not feel defeated. They weep from exhaustion, from grief, but also from fierce pride. Finland, the small nation of farmers, resisted. It looked the giant in the eye and did not blink. It preserved what mattered most, something even Stalin could not steal, its independence and its dignity. The entire world, which expected Finland's annihilation in days, witnessed a miracle of resilience. The lesson was clear: size does not measure courage. But the story of the Winter War does not end in Helsinki or Moscow. Its deepest and most ironic echo will resound elsewhere, in Berlin. In the corridors of power of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler and his generals watched the events in Finland with obsessive attention. The reports from German military attachés are detailed and devastating. They describe a chaotic Red Army with incompetent command, non-existent logistics, and poorly prepared and demoralized troops. The tactics are brutal but ineffective. The losses, astronomical. Hitler, who already harbored a deep contempt for what he considered the Jewish Bolshevik Slavic horde, finds in the Winter War confirmation of all his prejudices. He reads the reports and concludes that the Red Army is a paper tiger, a giant with feet of clay, inflated by propaganda but hollow inside. This conclusion becomes a central piece in his strategic thinking. It will encourage him to make the most fateful decision of his life, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Here history folds back on itself in a cycle of hubris. Soviet arrogance, which mocked the small Finland and paid a terrible price, now directly feeds German arrogance, which will mock Stalin. The cycle closes. When German panzers advanced through Ukraine and Belarus 2 years later, Wehrmacht generals, exultant with their initial victories, repeat a phrase that seems straight out of the Finnish front. They don't know how to fight. They are primitives. And when the winter of 1941 arrives, a winter even more brutal than that of 1939, history repeats itself as a tragic farce. It is Hitler's turn to learn the lesson Stalin should already have known. No one defeats Russia when General Winter decides to fight. War is a mirror, and he who mocks the enemy in the ice one day sees himself reflected in its shards. The humiliation of the Soviet Union in Finland, in a way, paved the way for its greatest trial and, ultimately, its greatest glory in the Great Patriotic War. Back in 1940, in the corridors of the Kremlin, Stalin locks the final Winter War report in a drawer. The numbers enrage him. Over 320,000 Soviet casualties to just over 25,000 Finnish ones, a ratio of nearly 13-1. It is a strategic victory, but an unprecedented moral and military humiliation. He orders the official history to be rewritten. In Soviet schoolbooks and military records, the Winter War will be portrayed as a successful operation to secure the borders of Leningrad, a minor and victorious conflict. The truth, like the soldiers' bodies, is buried under a thick layer of propaganda. It will remain frozen for decades until the fall of the Soviet Union itself. Only in the 1990s, with the opening of the archives, will the world confirm what the Finns always knew. The scale of the disaster was even greater than the legends told. The Soviet Union measured its victory in square kilometers of annexed territory, but Finland measured its own in the preservation of its soul. And in the memory of history, there is no doubt who truly won. Snow falls slowly over the fields of Suomussalmi. 85 years have passed. Where there was once the roar of tanks and the cries of men, there is now only silence. No sound of gunfire, no column of smoke on the horizon. Just the wind. The same wind that whistled between the pines and froze tears on soldiers' faces, that still seems to carry the stories of the men who marched into the ice trying to prove they were gods. Today, in the places where Soviet divisions were annihilated, there are only dense forests and tranquil lakes. Nature, indifferent to human history, has reclaimed what was hers. The snow covers everything, as it always has, but it does not forget. Decades later, when the Soviet Union crumbled and the dusty Kremlin archives were opened, historians and researchers revisited the numbers with renewed astonishment. The legend confirmed itself as fact. The small Finland, with fewer than 4 million inhabitants, had indeed faced an empire of 170 million and survived. The raw numbers tell part of the story, an army that lost 13 times more men than its adversary. But the numbers do not speak of the cold that broke bones, the fear of an enemy you cannot see, or the sound of a Molotov cocktail exploding on a tank's steel. They do not speak of Lauri Vine, who returned home and tried to forget what he saw. They do not speak of Andrei Petrov, the engineer who disappeared for telling the truth to a regime that lived on lies. The Winter War taught the world a lesson that many at the time refused to learn. Arrogance is always the first victim of war. Stalin believed he could crush Finland with numbers. Hitler, having seen Stalin's failure, foolishly believed he would succeed where the Red Army had failed. Both discovered that winter chooses no sides. It merely reveals the truth. In the years that followed, Finland became a silent symbol of resistance. Its Motti tactic came to be studied in military academies around the world as a classic example of asymmetric warfare. Simo Häyhä, the White Death, entered history as the deadliest sniper of all time, with over 500 confirmed kills in less than 100 days. But he never became a boastful hero. When, already old, he was asked the secret of his legendary marksmanship, he replied with Finnish simplicity, "Harjoitus," practice. Simplicity defeated complexity. Patience defeated haste. Silence defeated the shout. The Soviet Union tried to rewrite history, but the snow preserved the truth. The censored reports, the hidden numbers, the silenced heroes, all came to light. And the world discovered that the greatest land empire on the planet had bled nearly to death at the hands of farmers and hunters on skis. The lesson of Finland is not just military, it is philosophical. It reminds us that power lies not in the size of the army, but in the determination of its people. That technology without wisdom is just a burden. That blind obedience without adaptability is a form of collective suicide. And that, in the end, no political system, no ideology, is more powerful than the instinct of a people fighting for their home. Lauri Väinö, the soldier we saw cleaning his rifle at the beginning of this story, survived the war. He returned to his village, helped rebuild what was destroyed, and lived a long and quiet life. He died old, in peace, surrounded by children and grandchildren who never heard a single war story from him. He didn't need to speak. His eyes, the same ones that saw the aurora borealis dance over the frozen bodies of his enemies, carried the silent weight of one who survived the impossible. And in his silence there was more truth than in all the Soviet history books. If this journey through the snow and history made you reflect, and if you believe there are countless other stories like this, forgotten and waiting to be told the right way, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week we unearth the echoes of the past to understand the present. The snow continues to fall over Finland. The forests stand tall, and the wind still whispers between the pines, reminding everyone that hubris has a short memory, but the snow never forgets. When the Soviet Union mocked Finland, it thought victory was a matter of mathematics. But in war, as in life, the cold does not respect statistics. And the snow, once tinged red, forever remembers the names of those who laughed too soon. The Winter War ended in March 1940, but its echo reverberates to this day, not as a legend, but as a lesson. A lesson about humility, about resistance, and about the eternal price of arrogance. The snow chooses no sides, but it always, in the end, reveals the truth.